I'm Peter Klein from Baylor University, and I'm happy to talk to you about what my colleagues and I are calling the judgment-based approach to entrepreneurship. We borrow the term judgment from Frank Knight and from many other scholars who have written about entrepreneurship with particular emphasis on uncertainty. So the way most of us understand uncertainty derives from Knight's famous distinction between probabilistic risk and something else, what we call Knightian uncertainty. And there's a lot of interesting discussion about exactly what Knightian uncertainty is, right? The conventional way it's described as a situation where you don't know what's going to happen in the future, and you don't have a formal probability model or some kind of a mathematical estimate that you can use to figure out what's likely to happen. So, when you throw dice, you don't know what number will come up, but on a normal die, you know that there are 6 possible numbers. The likelihood of any number coming up is 1/6. That's a very different kind of a problem, a different question from saying, what is the likelihood that my business venture will be successful next year? What's the likelihood that, a war will break out, or that I'll have success or lack of success in my personal life or in my studies? Those are situations where we also don't know what is going to happen, but we can't really rely on the same kind of mental model that we do when we deal with probabilistic risk. What exactly is this? What is the true nature of this uncertainty? There's a lot of literature and interesting debate about that, but in most of my work and the work of my colleagues in this judgment-based approach, we remain fairly agnostic about what Knightian uncertainty really is. Instead, we try to focus on what we think Knightian uncertainty does. In other words, what are the implications for entrepreneurs, for how entrepreneurs engage and attempt to enroll external stakeholders, in particular providers of financial capital, also people who might want to join the entrepreneurial team, suppliers, and so forth. The entrepreneur has some belief in her mind about what is going to happen in the future if she proceeds with her plan or her set of experiments as she wants to do. But she's got to convince other parties that those beliefs, those expectations are reasonable. And to do that can be quite challenging. It can involve certain kinds of signaling, and it can involve writing contracts in certain ways. In a recent paper, my colleagues and I used the language of shared mental models, that under Knightian uncertainty, the entrepreneur has to try to achieve some kind of shared understanding of the future by means of establishing shared cognition or a shared mental model with these other stakeholders about what is reasonable to expect about the future. So why do we use the word judgment? Well, in Knight's Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, but also in other important contributions like von Mises' great book, Human Action, and also in Mark Cassin's book on the entrepreneur in the early 80s, these authors use the word judgment to describe a kind of decision-making under uncertainty that is neither rational choice, as in I've got some mathematical model and I've decided the optimal, the thing that maximizes expected utility or expected profit or whatever is this, and any rational person would make the same decision. That's how you can act under conditions of risk. At the other extreme, just random guessing, right? I have no idea what's going to happen. I can't describe it, so I'm just going to close my eyes and pick something or throw a dart at the dartboard. Knight and these other scholars suggested that there was something in between, right? That there is a way that all of us, to a greater or lesser degree, and skilled, experienced entrepreneurs to a very high degree, can anticipate in a reasonable way what is more or less likely to happen in the future. Again, without using a mathematical model, but also not purely guessing at random. And we all use we have this concept in mind in everyday life. We call it intuition, or we call it a gut instinct, a feeling in my bones. I can't exactly articulate why I believe this thing will happen in the future, but I really do believe it. And I have some reasonable grounds for believing it. The Germans have a great word to describe this faculty. They use the word verstehen, which is usually translated into English as understanding, but it's really kind of a very deep, fundamental understanding. When you talk to successful entrepreneurs, they can often tell you they have some anticipations in their mind. They feel very confident that certain things will happen in the future. They're not always correct, but they have skilled entrepreneurs are better than other people at anticipating what the uncertain future will look like. In other words, they are better than others at exercising judgment under uncertainty, making judgmental decisions, judging the uncertain future in a way that yield, in pursuit of profit, the desire to avoid loss. Right now, we all engage in judgment to some degree, but some of us are not very good at it. One challenge in using the term judgment is that certainly in English and other languages too, the word judgment has it has kind of a positive connotation. It sounds like wisdom or prudence. And really what we mean there is someone who has good judgment. In the entrepreneurship context, we use the word judgment in a very formal sense. In other words, judgment is the act of judging the future. You may be lousy at it, but you're still doing it, right? Anyone who is engaged in entrepreneurial activity is engaged in the exercise of judgment. It's just some people do it better than others. So how do you exercise judgment in a commercial context, right? Well, it's by taking ownership and taking responsibility of critical resources, assets, and then using them, combining them, recombining them, deploying them in the pursuit of whatever the objective might be, financial profit or some other objective, if it's a explicitly social venture, and in the desire to avoid economic loss. That's really all the judgment-based view argues, is that the right way to think about entrepreneurship is about individuals and groups trying to deal with the uncertain future by exercising judgment in applying means in the present to try to bring about desired ends in the future. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. I do like to emphasize this notion of kind of responsibility or stewardship that is implied by the notion of judgment, because some of our theories in entrepreneurship, in particular some of the opportunity recognition theories, sort of abstract away from ownership and responsibility. It's just sort of about entrepreneurship is scanning the landscape, looking for great ideas, and sort of acting upon them somehow, but without necessarily having skin in the game. So a critical assumption of the judgment-based approach is that, entrepreneurship is not actually taking place unless somebody has skin in the game. Somebody has assets invested under conditions of uncertainty where you might get a positive return, you might get a negative return. There's a line from Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, Frank Knight's book, that is widely quoted, but maybe in a different way than the way I would, what I think we should get out of it. And the quote reads as follows. Knight says, the only risk, he's got that kind of in scare quotes, meaning it's really not risk, it's uncertainty. The only so-called risk which leads to a profit is a unique uncertainty resulting from an exercise of ultimate responsibility, which in its very nature cannot be insured, nor capitalized, nor salaried. Now, you might have heard, and maybe you've discussed with your students, the conceptualization of Knightian uncertainty as uninsurable risk. We sometimes distinguish between insurable risk and uninsurable risk, Knightian uncertainty being the latter, meaning because, not everybody in the insurance market can agree on the probabilities. There's no way we can write contracts such that we can pool these uncertainties and so forth the way we can do with probabilistic risk. So Knight says, true uncertainty, the thing that yields profit in a world of uncertainty, right, is something that cannot be insured, nor capitalized, nor salaried. But notice he says this uncertainty results from an exercise of ultimate responsibility, meaning that the party or group that is exercising judgment is the party that kind of ultimately at the end of the day has to make the final decision about what to do. There's the old, expression, I think was it Harry Truman who supposedly had a thing on his desk that said the buck stops here, right? So the entrepreneur in this model is the party with whom the buck stops, right? Because the entrepreneur can always delegate to other people some day-to-day decision rights. You can delegate to a manager, some decision authority in the firm. You can hire a consultant to do some forecasting for you, but it's the entrepreneur is the one who has the ultimate responsibility to decide what will be done, right? To decide which managers or which consultants to hire, whether or not to act upon their advice. So judgment in this sense is kind of linked to ownership and responsibility of resources. I think that's something that is a little bit distinct about this approach compared to some of the other approaches that you find in the literature. Another quote from the economist Ludwig Lachmann in a book in the 1950s on the theory of capital. He has this line, he says, "We are living in a world of unexpected change, i.e. Knightian uncertainty. Hence, capital combinations will be ever changing, will be dissolved and reformed. In this activity, we find the real function of the entrepreneur." So in the judgment-based approach, the real function of the entrepreneur is this combining and recombining of productive resources under uncertainty in an attempt to produce stuff that consumers will want to buy, to make money, to earn profits, and to avoid losses. A couple of their additions or sort of applications. I've used the term, or Nikolai Foss and I have used the term beliefs, actions, results, or BAR, as kind of an operating framework for using the judgment-based approach. And really what we mean here is that to explain entrepreneurial activity, we need to focus primarily on three things. Number one, beliefs, the entrepreneur's beliefs about the uncertain future, as well as the entrepreneur's beliefs about the present, right? The state of technology and what kind of resources are available and so forth. So the entrepreneur has these beliefs about the present, beliefs about the future, what will be future consumer demands, what might be future competitor reactions, or legal and regulatory changes or whatever. And the entrepreneur also has beliefs about her ability to bring about the future that she desires, right? Self-efficacy in some sense. So based on those beliefs, the entrepreneur decides to act or maybe not to act, right? That could be starting a firm or growing a firm. It could be introducing a new product. It could be introducing a new organizational structure. I mean, all of the things in, Schumpeter's 5 types of entrepreneurship. Those are actions that the entrepreneur takes based on her beliefs about the present, her beliefs about possible futures, and her beliefs about her ability to bring about the future that she desires. So you've got beliefs, then you've got action, and then you've got some results, right? Either the beliefs were correct and the actions bring about the result that was desired, or maybe they're not. These results could be objective, quantifiable, accounting profits, firm value, some kind of metrics. They could also be subjective, autonomy and satisfaction, or maybe achieving some social goal. And then I guess there's sort of an additional step would be, then there's some adjustments or reactions, right? Maybe if the action did not bring about the desired result, the entrepreneur wants to make some changes and go it again, or maybe the entrepreneur runs out of money and have kind of selected out of the environment. So sort of Darwinian selection and Lamarckian selection, if you want. But one of the reasons that I think this approach is interesting and why I think you're including it in the PDW is that it places a strong emphasis on action. In other words, the belief stage is sort of like the pre-entrepreneurship stage. So we can have a nice conversation about possible futures, and we can theorize about it. We could do some focus groups. We could do a survey. We could do quantitative forecasting. We could do whatever we want as we think about what we might want to do someday. Maybe you do this as a classroom exercise. Then the bell rings, class is over, everybody goes home. In the view of the judgment-based approach, no actual entrepreneurship took place, in that setting. We were talking about entrepreneurship, but we don't do entrepreneurship until we have skin in the game, right? And until we take actions that could yield benefits with the probability of loss. I have argued, maybe being definitely being provocative, deliberately provocative, that using this kind of beliefs, actions, results language, I'm getting ahead of myself here, is better than opportunity language. And I think the opportunity construct can be possibly misleading and sort of confuses our thinking in certain ways because, the ordinary language notion of opportunity relates to something objective. Because I have Zoom installed on my computer, that gives us the opportunity to record this session. But the way entrepreneurship scholars have used the term opportunity is much broader than that. It relates to things I wish would happen. It is used to describe, business models. It's used to describe my vision of the possible future. I don't like using the word opportunity for that because opportunity can really only be identified ex post if the thing you did was successful, right? My business venture yielded profits. I'm so glad I was the first to realize that opportunity before anybody else. But it's very hard to describe failure in opportunity language, right? I mean, there wasn't an opportunity to discover and act upon if you lost money. So people try to sort of squirm their way out of that and say, well, I thought there was an opportunity, but there really wasn't. Okay, but then it's not an opportunity, then it's just a belief. So we think it's better to just speak about your beliefs about the present and future, the actions you take to try to bring about the future you want, and what happens. Well, a couple of other applications before we sort of wrap up. I mentioned ownership before, and I've been very interested in how judgment is exercised by different individuals in terms of how skilled they are at exercising ultimate responsibility. I just published a paper earlier this year with several colleagues called Ownership Competence, trying to introduce the idea that just like in strategy, we have different notions of competence or capability, that maybe we can also describe entrepreneurial skill as a kind of competence at exercising this ownership function. And we link to several papers or several research streams in entrepreneurship, and I guess in strategy too, about so-called smart money or active ownership, or how family businesses are organized, and even this literature on sort of the strengths and weaknesses of the corporate form versus partnerships, proprietorships, cooperatives, and so forth, as ways of saying, well, how do entrepreneurs exercise their judgment, or what techniques can they use, and what are the implications of the fact that some people are systematically better at exercising judgment than others. In the paper, we distinguish three different kinds of ownership competence: what we call governance competence, which is how to create and capture value from the resources you currently own and control; matching competence, which is deciding what resources and combinations of resources are a good match for your attributes, your talents, your experience; and then what we call timing competence, which is knowing when the ownership pattern at present is not the right one, and you need to buy or sell or restructure and reorganize. And we claim that thinking about ownership competence and these different types of ownership competence sheds a lot of insight into some of the phenomena, both at the individual level, at the firm and industry level, even at the economy level. You can think about a market economy as a means of sort of moving resources around so that ultimately, resources are flowing into the hands of the entrepreneurs who are best positioned to use them to create value. I think there's some interesting implications too for stakeholder models and for debates about CSR and ESG and so forth. I think we need to remember that in any organization, right, you have entrepreneur owners. You also have non-entrepreneur, non-owner managers. The old Milton Friedman argument from his infamous piece on social responsibility in the New York Times was his argument was not that social responsibility is a bad thing, not that not that we don't want social responsibility in society, but that we don't want hired managers allocating the firm's resources in pursuit of socially responsible objectives unless we can be sure that that's what the owners of these resources would want. There's sort of an agency conflict between managers and owners. Now, if you take that argument and now you add 90 and uncertainty, And it's not just that the managers might be doing something the owners don't want, it's that the managers are not the ones who have to deal with unanticipated shocks, who have this sort of ultimate responsibility for deciding how the firm's resources will be used under conditions of Knightian uncertainty. That responsibility lies with the owners. And it sort of adds an extra wrinkle to this way of thinking about CSR, stakeholder models. It's one thing to say lots of parties should have an input into what a business does, including members of society. It's another to say, can all of those people acting together as part of a team, maybe through voting, are they well positioned to exercise ultimate responsibility under conditions of Knightian uncertainty? I think the literature on Knightian uncertainty and the literature on organizational form would suggest that very heterogeneous groups of people with different objectives and interests are not very well suited for making good decisions, for exercising good judgment under conditions of uncertainty. So to make a long story short, if you take Knightian uncertainty, you add heterogeneity of resources, and the idea from Knight and Mises and others that entrepreneurs are in the business of allocating resources to try to create and capture value, you recognize that judgment under uncertainty is a very useful way to conceptualize entrepreneurship and the business of entrepreneurial action. The judgment-based approach links to a lot of other approaches in the entrepreneurship literature. There's interesting work on cognition and sort of the stages, you might call it the stages of entrepreneurial judgment. I've got this paper with Mark Packard and Brent Clark, where we try to distinguish different steps within the judgment process. For example, judgment is about using means to achieve desired ends. Well, if you're sort of starting with a blank slate, I don't really know exactly what end I want to pursue. Maybe I want commercial viability, or I want to make the world a better place, but I don't know exactly what that means in terms of a venture or a product or a structure. So the set of ends is sort of open to me at the beginning stages. And also there are lots of different means that I could employ to achieve those ends. You find in the entrepreneurship literature, the opportunity discovery approach, it places most of the emphasis on ends, right? You need to discover or find a vision of what outcome you want to obtain, and then you just get the resources that you need. That's the famous Howard Stevenson, Harvard Business School definition of entrepreneurship, right? Pursuit of opportunity without regard to means currently under control. But I think, from the literatures on effectuation and bricolage and some of the behavioral literature, we recognize that that's not what entrepreneurs necessarily do, right? Many times they start by focusing on means that are currently available and trying to find out what are the best ends that can be achieved using those means. Now, if you add Knightian uncertainty to that story, you get a very interesting way of thinking about different paths by which entrepreneurial judgment is manifest. So under uncertainty, do you try to first get a handle? We use the language of sort of closing the set. Uncertainty can be interpreted, if you like, as like a set of elements that's open or unbounded. Whereas under risk, you have a finite set of things that can happen. There's 6 numbers on the die. It's just a question of 1 out of 6. Under Knightian uncertainty, you don't even know what all the possible options are. So starting from a condition of deep uncertainty, I can either first try to close the set of outcomes by narrowing it down to 1 or 2 or 3 things I want to achieve, work on that, try to resolve those sources of uncertainty first, and then work on choosing among the potentially unlimited means, which are the best ones to achieve that desired outcome. Or I can do it the other way around. I can start by trying to get a better handle, have a better understanding of what resources are currently available to me, close the set of options first, and then think about narrowing down the set of outcomes. So there's a lot of connection there to the literature on the entrepreneurial process at the beginning stages. And then, of course, the entrepreneurial process once entrepreneurship per se begins, Once we have skin in the game, we have assets under investment, we need to make adjustments, right? We may be performing controlled experiments and then restructuring our project or venture based on the result of those experiments. So we think this view blends nicely with some of the cognitive and behavioral literature on sort of the ex ante processes of judgment, and also the literature on the entrepreneurial process in the middle and sort of ex post. I think there's some interesting links to entrepreneurship in institutions or entrepreneurship in public policy. I already mentioned a little bit about social responsibility, stakeholder models, and those kinds of ideas. Yeah, what else? Obviously, strategy has a lot of connections to the judgment-based approach, as well as theories of the firm, transaction cost theories or resource-based theories of the firm and the boundaries of the firm, the structure of the firm. For example, if we think of a multi-person firm as a kind of distributed hierarchy of judgment, so you have the owners exercising ultimate responsibility, exercising true judgment, but then they delegate a lot of responsibility to subordinates, and they might say, look, there's a lot of uncertainty in our industry, our market, related to our venture. I'm tasking you, my subordinate, with figuring out the best way to handle that uncertainty. I want you to make investments. I want you to make adjustments. I want you to act on my behalf to bring about the goals that we have agreed upon. Well, that decision maker, they're exercising something that's kind of like judgment, but it was only given to them by the party that exercises the sort of original judgment rights. One of our papers, we use the language of what we call original judgment and derived judgment. And so in a multi-person firm, the original judgment held by owners is delegated to people throughout the organization, but it's kind of a nested hierarchy in that the party who is the sort of ultimate owner can decide who will be given which decision rights and can make changes to that allocation of decision rights. Whereas, if I'm in the middle of that hierarchy, I can't decide what things I get to decide. That's sort of given to me by whoever hired me, whoever is supervising me. So this idea of sort of a distributed hierarchy or delegated hierarchy of judgment yields a lot of interesting insights in compensation policy and monitoring and evaluation and how large a firm should be and whether things should be vertically integrated or outsourced. I'm also working on a book, a sort of a practitioner or outreach kind of a book with Nikolai Foss on the notion of the sort of super flat hierarchy. So you hear a lot of people talking about companies like Valve or Morningstar or Gore that are super flat. Even people use the term the bossless organization, that we really don't need a managerial hierarchy. Everybody can either be a sole proprietor or we can interact through these diffuse networks, decentralized networks. I think that sort of model of organizing, like any other model, has pros and cons. But I think the failure to really think about what judgment and ultimate responsibility mean have led a lot of scholars and some practitioners to exaggerate the benefits of the super flat structure over more traditionally organized structures in which entrepreneurship also can take place.